In a voice as quiet as if he were asking me to pass the sugar, my father said, "Son, don't shoot until the first man puts his foot on the lawn. And then, don't you miss." In that instant, there opened up in me a great awareness. I knew then who I was. I was a Negro, a person to be hunted, hanged, abused, discriminated against, kept in poverty and ignorance. It made no difference how intelligent or talented my millions of brothers and I were, nor how virtuously we lived. A curse like that of Judas was on us.
Walter White's experience would eventually lead him to become one of the foremost civil rights leaders in America. The militia finally arrived in Atlanta to restore order.
After the riot, Washington came to the city and he tried to find a silver lining to what had happened. But in truth, this time, Washington's conciliatory attitude, it just didn't hold water for many people. This was Atlanta. This was supposedly the experiment that would prove what you projected in terms of racial uplift. We would cooperate with the white community economically. We wouldn't agitate too much politically. We wouldn't demand the vote that much. We would try to follow a good Protestant work ethic, buy a little property, gain a little capital. We did that in Atlanta. And look what happened.
The riot reinforced Du Bois's growing resolve to exchange his scholar's life for an agitator's.
And in fact, the Atlanta riot convinced him more than anything else that the Atlanta or the South was not going to change anytime soon.
But if the South would not change, Du Bois would. He moved to New York in 1910 to join forces with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, a newly formed interracial organization that would become the driving force in the civil rights movement. Appointed the editor of the NAACP's journal, The Crisis, Du Bois was determined to forge the magazine into a weapon against Jim Crow. The Crisis battled racial discrimination, exposed atrocities and outrages against blacks, supported women's rights, and promoted race pride in the arts and literature. Within 4 months, the number of subscribers jumped from 1,000 to 6,000, and eventually soared to over 100,000. Du Bois startled his readers in 1912 when he supported Wilson for president, even though Wilson was a Democrat and a Southerner. Wilson, he said, had promised fairness and justice for blacks. He seemed a man of word, but Du Bois warned Wilson what blacks expected from him.
We want to be treated as men. We want to vote. We want our children to be educated. We want lynching stopped. We want no longer to be herded as cattle on streetcars and railroads. We want the right to earn a living and own property. Be not untrue, President Wilson, to the highest ideals of American democracy.
Immediately after his election, Wilson gave the green light to 3 Southern cabinet members to segregate their departments. One white supervisor boasted, "There are no government positions for Negroes in the South. A Negro's place is in the cornfield." Du Bois attacked Wilson.
The federal government has set the colored apart as if mere contact with them were contamination. Behind screens and closed doors, they now sit as though leprous. How long will it be before the hateful epithets of nigger and Jim Crow are openly applied? W.E.B. Du Bois.
In 1915, The Klansman was made into a motion picture, Birth of a Nation. The NAACP launched a major campaign to ban it, as violence erupted in several cities where the film played. In Lafayette, Indiana, a white man killed a black teenager after seeing the movie. Elsewhere, gangs of whites attacked blacks on the street. And the Ku Klux Klan was reborn.
Birth of a Nation and its link to Ku Klux Klan recruiting is not so much the numerical quality of it, but rather that ideologically it gave Northerners some form of rhetoric that helped them understand the racism they were already believing anyway.
In the midst of the battle against Birth of a Nation, Booker T. Washington died. Du Bois praised Washington for the good he had done, but said black people had made little progress under his leadership. Du Bois's battle with Washington was over, but his quarrel with Wilson continued. Wilson declared war on Germany in 1917. Although he supported the president, Du Bois did so reluctantly. He knew black soldiers would suffer in America's Jim Crow army. In 1917, black soldiers of the famed 24th Infantry 3rd Battalion were assigned to Fort Logan outside of Houston, Texas.
Houston had the largest black community in the state of Texas at the time, and that was a threat to many white people. The police force there was very aggressive in enforcing laws in that community, and the target of that enforcement strategy was frequently people of color. There was no commitment to law when black people were brutalized and tortured and murdered and assaulted by mobs and through racial violence. The law was never there to protect you. And into that troubled environment was a black battalion. And these were very proud soldiers who had fought for the country, who were not prepared to be subjected to the indignation and oppression, who had been taught to fight when their rights were in question, when their liberty was in question, when their survival was in question. You cannot brutalize an individual who has some self-respect, who believes that their life has meaning and dignity, and persecute that individual and marginalize that individual without at some point that individual standing up and saying, "You have threatened my life, you have challenged my life, and I'm now going to fight back."
For months, black soldiers had suffered non-stop harassment from the Houston police. On August 23rd, their anger boiled over.
Dear brother, I write you for the last time in this world. I am to be executed tomorrow morning. I know this is shocking news, but don't worry too much, as it is God's will. I was convicted at the General Court-Martial held here last month. Trial and murder. It is true that I went downtown without camp, but I am innocent of getting any blood. Goodbye and meet me in heaven. Your brother, Charles Baltimore.
Charles Baltimore was one of 13 men condemned to die on the morning of December 11th, 1917. 4 months earlier, after being arrested without cause and beaten by police, Baltimore and 100 of his fellow soldiers marched into the city and opened fire. When the shooting stopped, 16 whites and 4 black soldiers were dead. 19 men were sentenced to death. The first 13 to die were not told of their sentence, nor the date of their execution, until shortly before they were taken to the gallows on the morning of December the 11th, 1917. They were denied their right to appeal to the president. The men requested to be shot as soldiers. The army refused their request.
Houston was not an ordinary outburst. They were not young recruits. They were not wild and drunkard wastrels. They were disciplined men who said, "This is enough. We'll stand no more." They broke the law. Against their punishment, if it were legal, we cannot protest. But we can protest, and we do protest against the shameful treatment which these men and which we, their brothers, receive all our lives, and which our fathers received, and which our children await. And above all, we raise a clenched hand against the hundreds of thousands of white murderers and rapists and scoundrels who have oppressed, killed, ruined, and robbed and debased their black fellow men and fellow women, and yet today walk scot-free. Injustice. Uncondemned by millions of their white fellow citizens, and unrebuked by the President of the United States. W.E.B. Du Bois.